Hello again, this is Ron Stupp, architect and amateur historian. The Romanesque is the sixth presentation in a series of 13 presentations I've prepared explaining the development of the 2,000-year history of Western Christian architecture. We're now getting to the place where stone vault fireproofing is applied to the basilica form. This combination of stone vaulting in the nave, transepts, and side aisles of basilicas becomes the familiar form of Western Christian architecture. The subtitle to this presentation is, "But It's Dark in Here," and that speaks to the difficulty of bringing natural light into a dark nave. The outward springing forces of the stone barrel vaults became a seemingly impossible problem to overcome when the builders tried to cut window openings in the stone vaults to allow natural light to enter the church. The result was a dark church interior lighted by small window openings, candles, and torches. This presentation ends presenting examples of the beautifully carved stone column and pilaster capitals that were used for organic ornamentation as well as to tell stories from the Bible. These fancifully carved capitals were instructive and expressed the belief that all things in nature had a spirit. The Italians later considered this French way of architecture a debasement of classical Roman architecture, setting the stage for the later so-called Renaissance, where Roman and Greek architecture is applied to the basilica and becomes the church prototype during the neoclassical, Baroque, and Rococo periods. The next presentation is the Romanesque, and it's the basilica fireproof, but it's dark in here. The reason I gave it that title, if you remember in previous presentations, I always wood truss, when I build up, going from the ground on up to the roof, I'd show wood truss, wood truss, wood truss, because those wood trusses became a real problem in that with lighting the place with candles and torches, a lot of them burned down. I shouldn't say a lot, many burned down. And so the idea was, well, how do you stop that? And then they employed the architecture of stone vaulting as a way to separate the torches and candles in the nave and the side aisles from the wood trusses by putting a fireproof stone vault above the side aisles in the nave. And the case in point in reverse is what happened in Paris when the wood timbers caught on fire from workers in the attic up there in the timbers, not because of anything that happened below, except for the steeple and pieces of scaffolding and falling through some of the vaults, the stone vaulting, and creating holes which provided a fire path in some instances. The fireproofing worked marvelously to preserve the interior of Notre Dame in Paris. But that was the idea, is to build stone above as fireproofing. And then as the second part of this says, but it's dark in here. And this is the problem they wrestled with in the Romanesque architecture. And they didn't have a solution till the 12th century when Abbe came up with Saint Denis. But I want to trace what happened in leading from it's really dark in here to the affirmation of God is light, and structure, the church architecture manifested that very important piece of liturgy. God is light. That's really what these churches were all about during the medieval period. The Middle Ages were not called that during the medieval period. They didn't call themselves the Middle Ages. They referred to their era as the end times. Church building increased after the passage of the millennium. As I said before, I think many of the people thought Christ was coming and that was going to be the end of the world at the year 1000. And you'll find, we'll show churches built in the 9th century, 10th century, and then after the millennium passes, then you'll see a lot of churches with dates 1082 or something like that, 11 so-so, and 12 so-and-so. I think people felt more comfortable putting out a lot of energy and wealth to build these great churches. Okay, the church, keep in mind, the church was the protector of man and the framework of society. So the church was still held in high regard. A lot happened on the way to the French Revolution, and the church was looked at as a predator and an enemy. But the part of that we're going to talk about today is the Romanesque, and the church at this time was a protector of man, and it formed the framework of the social order. Back to the medieval timeline, and we're going to talk about around 800. That's the rise of Charlemagne in France, and we'll go through the Romanesque period, which ends around 12th century. A few large stone buildings were constructed after the Constantinian basilicas of the 4th century. Many were smaller ones during the 6th and 7th centuries. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Carolingian dynasty, Frankish Empire, they revived the basilical form of architecture. Now we know what was going on over here on the east, Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Now we have movement in the west starting to build great architecture again. So what happened is the barbarians started to run the show, and they were pretty good military men, but they didn't have a lot of government skills. My favorite is Charles the Hammer Martel. You know, I'd love to have that sobriquet. Maybe we should give that to somebody in Dream Builders, you know, call him the Hammer. And then Charlemagne. Charles Martel's famous for stopping the influx of Muslims into France in the famous Battle of Tours in 732. So he cleared the Muslims out of France. Spain still wasn't able to do that until 1492, the same year that Columbus set sail. And then on the right hand, we have a very important person who became the king of the Franks, the king of the Lombards, and the emperor of the Romans in 800. And this is called the Carolingian Renaissance. And if you look at his left hand in the lower right corner of the screen, there's a globus cruciger. And I didn't know what that was called. It has nothing to do with Christian architecture, but I thought I found out the name of it because you'll see Christ or emperors holding the globe, sometimes with or sometimes without a cross, but that's what it's called. So now you know. Okay, St. Peter and St. Paul. We're going to look at their basilica in Agliate, Italy, or Agliate, Italy. It was built in the 9th century. Here's a Google of it. You can see it's a basilical form. You know, there's 3 aisles, 1, 2, 3. There's clerestory that goes around it. You know, that center walls are pushed up roof, probably with a timber roof. There's the clerestories there. I make a note that this 19th century bell tower doesn't belong to the composition that was added later. What we have here, and you may see these from time to time in Christian architecture, this is built in the Lombardy region. If you remember, Charlemagne became the emperor of the Lombards, and the Lombardy region is part of his kingdom. And so this building and similar to that started to flow west. These things are called Lombardy arches. They're blind arches. I think they're just decorative. You'll see these on the sides of buildings from time to time. It's one of those Christian symbols that find their way into later architecture. Okay, so the inside, you can see the timber roof, and we'll just take like a basilica. It has a bema, a nave, an altar, an apse, and etc. And the triforium is blank. In a lot of cases in these early churches, they were used for frescoes or bas-relief carvings or paintings or tapestries, of course, biblical subjects. And then the glorification arch. We have a clerestory, and that lets the light to the interior. So as I showed you on the front of it, that these are the columns pushing that wall above the side roof, which is probably along here, and that brings light in. And then the wood truss roof. And then on the right, I want to bring up something to your attention. You'll notice that this column, capital right here, and the bottom of the arch don't quite meet. Well, that's not a problem, because if you look along the arcade here, That capital's different than that one, different than that one, different than that one, and so forth. And that's because this time they didn't have the skills to build these and carve these, so they just borrowed them from other buildings, and they didn't quite fit. And so they used what is called an impost block, which you'll see repeatedly. And that is something that takes up for the improper height of the borrowed column and the bottom of the arch. They could have put a plinth under the column, but whenever you see these, it's called an impost block, and sometimes they're nicely carved, and other times they're kind of crude like this one. But it comes from these early churches borrowing marble and columns and carvings and so forth from old Roman buildings. It has a baptistry. The baptistry has, it looks like some medieval artwork along it, and there's this well. And one thing I want to point out that baptistries, the fonts tend to be octagonal on the outside. Here's the baptistry. It's octagonal. The apse is a half cylinder turned on its end, and underneath this roof is the dome of the exedra. And you can see this is pretty crude stonework. It would be called rubble stone, and you can see some of the attempt at putting some cut stone in the corners. Those would be coining, as we talked about last week. This is an example of an early church in Italy through, I believe, Charlemagne into France. And so this is the beginning of it. A major thing to talk about, a major influence are these pilgrimages. These are the pilgrim routes in Europe to get to Santiago de Compostela. And that was built, I think, before 1000. But you can see that's the main route. There's two routes through the Pyrenees, and then there's one along the coast. And of course, you could take a ship in some places. But basically, all these people in Europe, they would make these pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela in the northwest of Spain. And so why did they do that? Well, it was important for several reasons. It was so important that this is an example of a guidebook that was published to tell you where to stay and I think to where to avoid en route to St. James. So they started coming to the church. This church that's there right now was built in 1211 from across Europe to witness the tomb of the Apostle St. James, son of Zebedee, known as Santiago by Spanish Catholics. The remains of St. James were interred in this location sometimes after his recorded death. He was beheaded by a sword by Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem in 44 AD. It said that his body was taken up by angels and sailed in a rudderless, unattended boat to Iberia, Spain, where he preached. Pilgrimages became a huge industry producing miracles for profit, with a following of scam artists, I have to put in parentheses. A cult of saints developed. Saints became the heart of Christianity. In the medieval world, boundaries were blurred between the living and the dead. Saints were in heaven, but also were here. A saint could intervene in a person's life. Saints were supernatural, and including their body parts, retained supernatural powers. It became a passion to get close to one saint via a relic, hence the pilgrimages. And so these pilgrimage churches started to develop along the route through France on their way through Spain. To attract pilgrims in these churches, because pilgrims meant money, on the way to Santiago de Compostela, pilgrimage churches were built along the routes of travel. The church would house a relic or relics with the belief that the closer you were to the saint's relic, the closer you were to God. Here's a lower jawbone, and I have no ideas what these white things are, but this thing's scary. And then you can see some bone relics. This is called a reliquary, as is this. This reliquary has a skull, and the idea was to be close to your saint or these saints, and the closer you were to these saints, the closer you were to God. And so you went on this long, arduous trek to Santiago de Compostela, and you went there to see the sarcophagus
of St. James in the crypt, but above that was a statue of St. James. And evidently what you do once you get there is behind St. James, you can come and hug St. James. And these are modern day pilgrims doing just that. And the shield of St. James the Greater, are 3 scallop shells. It's interesting, here is a early medieval sculpture of people on pilgrimage. And if you look at this bag that he's carrying over his shoulder, there is a scallop shell right there, the symbol of St. James. So you knew that he was on his way to Compostela. Okay, so these are some of the pilgrimage routes in France. And I'm going to look at about 6, I think, different churches at various stages of Romanesque development leading up to the Gothic. The Galone Abbey in Saint Guillaume les Desert, and that's #1 down here. I've been there a couple of times. It's a beautiful little place. I took photographs of it. It's dark as heck in there, even with the lights on. Saint Philibert de Tournus Abbey here by Cluny. And I didn't know about this until Dick and Beth Mitchell showed me, I think it was a CD, and I was just so excited. I'll tell you why in a minute. Only I guess it would be excited, but it was fun. I didn't know about this. Yeah. Anyway, then most important is this Benedictine monastery in Cluny having an enormous influence over Christendom for the next 1,000 years or so. The revised monastic orders with over 1,400 dependencies across Europe. This was in 910 AD, right shortly before the millennium. I don't believe Cluny was considered a pilgrimage church, but it could have been. It was the largest Romanesque church ever built. And then we get to the Saint-Sernin Basilica in Toulouse. I've been there several times. It's a great church in the Southern style. A lot of it's brick because they don't have stone down there. It was a pilgrimage stop. And as you can see, here's a pilgrimage route going right through Toulouse on over to St. James. This is the oldest intact Romanesque church left in Europe. We'll go back to the Galone Abbey, the first one I was telling you about. It is dark in there, but you can see it has a nave, it has an altar, it has an apse, it has an exedra, and the use of stone Romanesque arches. You can't even see, this place is lighted with some artificial lighting, but you can see the windows are fairly small. There's just these 3 openings at the top of the exedra. We're standing here looking this way towards this apse, and you can see that window there is this window right here. Okay, there is the transept and the altar. It becomes the Latin cross. It's the typical floor plan now for just about every church built in the western side of Christendom. You can see it also has 2 side aisles. So it's a very small church, but it has all the parts. There's 3 apses. I'm not sure why. You'll see other early churches with 3 apses. I don't know if it has something to do with the Trinity or if it has something to do with displaying relics or whatever. I don't have a good explanation for why there are 3. And most importantly now, this was built in 742 to 812 AD. Here we have a stone vault ceiling, and there's no clerestory up here, or these are triforium. Yeah, these are triforium. There's side aisles and no clerestory. So it gets dark pretty quickly. And that's why I call this presentation, But It's Dark in Here. And what's typical now that we have to withstand the forces, remember this vault and these arches are springing out. And so to counter the springing arches, you can see these walls are very thick. And that is to control these forces. You can also see that there's buttresses to keep the half dome from springing out, and they can't cut large windows in because if they do so, they'll destroy the structural integrity. They haven't really fully learned how to control this and control the structural forces and let in light. So on the outside, you can see these small windows. There's those two big buttresses you saw on the plan. This is the apse, the exedras beyond this band right here. And we have the exedra here. And this is the barrel vault sky over the nave. This is an overexposed photograph, so you can see it. If you walk in there and look up, it's very, very dark. There's a stone cornice, and you'll see this in a lot of stone churches. It marks a spring line, but it also has a practical use, and we'll talk about that later. They use this to support the bottom of the wood framing that they span this, and then on top of the wood framing, they would lay the stones and mortar them together till the final stones are in place, and they could move that. If you look, you'll see the spring line of these vaults, and in this case, the arch, demarcated for probably for construction purposes. It also becomes a piece of art. These are stone Romanesque arches. They don't have Gothic arches yet. And these are called pilasters or pilasters. These are bulges in the wall to reinforce the wall. In other words, they put these pilasters here to carry the weight of these stone arches, which help carry the weight of the vault. And so they felt it necessary to the wall at that point. And keep in mind that word pilaster, because you'll see some beautiful columns that are column capitals that are three-sided, and they are meant to cap a pilaster, not a round column. You'll see the Lombardy arches here. You'll see, I think these are smaller ones here, but there's the Lombardy arches. Again, this is looking in the other direction, the small clerestory, the barrel vault ceiling, the Romanesque arches. Over exposed, you can see the vaulting in the aisles, the altar, the apse, etc., so forth. Stonework's better than the one we saw in Lombardy, but this one is not as up to the snuff with the later churches. And this diagram is kind of interesting because it shows how they built these vaults. And you'll see they built a wall, and here's that cornice piece of structure sticking out. And you can see where they put the wood centering, it's called. Of course, this would go over to the other walls. This is just half of it shown. And then they would build these arches on it, then put in the wood lagging and put the stone, or not brick, but stone arches, the wood lagging between the wood centering, and then they would put stones on that and then fill it with concrete and mortar. There's no triforium. There's the wood centering, Romanesque arch, and the barrel vault stones on the wood lagging to complete this barrel vault ceiling up here. And then lastly, the concrete / mortar fill. And this detail here shows how they slip the bricks back and forth so the mortar or concrete would adhere to the bricks and tighten up the connection between this part of the vault and this stone arch. You can see that concrete there tightening all this up. These are like masonry rebars, even though they don't work really as rebars, but that was the idea, to lock it all together. Okay, now Cluny, this is probably the most important Romanesque building in Western Christendom, Benedictine monastery. And it's the largest Roman church in Europe, consecrated in 909 AD. It was attacked by the Huguenots during the religious wars of 1562 through 1562 to 1698. And after the French Revolution in 1789, the abbey was sold for building stone and dismantled. Okay, so anyway, this is all that remains of it. You'll notice there's some flying buttresses. I don't know where they came from. That would not have been authentic. This was added on to for centuries and centuries. I suspect parts of it were turned out and rebuilt. It came time to put flying buttresses in, but that's really not the import of this building, this complex of buildings. And most important is, I didn't realize, but a monastery was considered a castle built against Satan. And this is what the main part of the church looked like plan. I think this part is newer, but this is the part that I just want to bring to your attention. Pilgrims would go into church. In the nave, you have the worshipers and you have the priest and so forth. at the altar or altar back here. And so the pilgrims would come in and they would pay homage to the relic, and they would march along the side aisles. And then the chevet was added behind the apse to keep circulation going. And then they usually had these radiating chapels. It's called the chevet right here. And radiating chapels with displays in them, or they could be chapels for worship. But the idea was you came in, you walk along here to see things. You could participate in the worship if you wanted to, but you could keep going and leave without bothering anybody. So this becomes a form, and this is what it looks like today. Not much left of it. There's the main crossing in one of the transept towers. You can see it's a beautiful building. I just think, some people ask, what are these holes in the wall for? They're not holes, they're pockets of stone, and that's where I think the scaffolding was locked in as they built it up and laid the stone coursing. This is a little bit off the pilgrimage route in France, but I wanted you to take a look at what a real barrel vault nave looks like. You can see the cross section here. This is curved towards you, and then cross section, you can see it's a vault on top of these piers. And this is what it looks like right here. You can see how dark this is. There's no triforium, there's no clerestory. It's just side aisle lighting. And they use this smooth surface as plastered, and they have all these frescoes. It's fairly famous. And that's what a barrel vault nave looks like uninterrupted. In other words, it's a smooth direction, unidirection, going from the entrance at the north exit at the west end to the east where the apse and the altar are. And there's no triforium, no clerestory. And then I found St. Philibert, thanks to the Mitchells, and it just made me, I felt like I found the missing link between man and ape, because it intrigues me about this building is these are cross vaults, meaning that these arches would form the vault we just saw in the last building. But what they did, they wanted to put some light in here. So they made vaults that went 90 degrees, and then they put windows in the end, which was really, that is the first step in becoming one of the Gothic architecture saving graces of God is light. And I'll show you a little bit about this because it's kind of interesting. They didn't, for some reason, you can see a groin vault right here in the side aisle. They didn't do it here because in the side aisle, these groin vaults are over a square space. It's an architectural problem. Here, they're over a rectangular space. And so they didn't know how to build a groin vault over the rectangular space because the arches are different here, here, and the diagonal. But here, all four arches are the same, and then they just bring the diagonal to meet wherever that is. So you can see here is that cross vault. It's just a simple vault going 90 degrees to the direction of the nave. And here's a cross section, you can see them. And what it reminds me of, and I don't think why this didn't continue, is it's like a washboard. You know, you walk down here, it goes ka-bump, 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 ka-bump. Not really too smooth, but they didn't need to fill this in. They could have filled this whole thing in with glass, which is what they ended up doing in the Gothic period. And you can see this is a diagram of these vaults. I call them cross vaults. They're not officially cross vault, but they cross the nave vaulting at a 90 degree. See, I call them cross barrel vaults. So anyway, there's the side aisle, groin vault. So they knew how to do it, but they didn't know how to do it over a rectangle. And there's the clerestory lighting. The windows are small, even though they could have blown that whole thing out and just left this as an arch there. And this all could have been glass. They didn't figure that out in time. Okay, so this is a series of these barrel vaults crossing the nave in kind of an unpleasant flow of space going from one end to the other. But I think it's nevertheless, it's a beautiful building. You can see the groin vault diagram here, and then the cross barrel vaults going across the nave, the side aisle, and the clerestory. So this church is on its way to becoming brighter. And then we get to the late Romanesque. This is the largest church still surviving, and that's in Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. It's a delightful church, you know, that Ville de Rose, the pink city, because all the bricks are this kind of rose color. I thought they were more salmon colored, and French doesn't sound as cool as Ville de Rose. So this is Saint-Sernin. You can see the cruciform plan, major tower over the crossing. If you look closely here at this aerial photograph, this is Market Day. I was there for Market Day. It's a lot of fun stuff going on. It's a great church, and it's worth a trip to Toulouse to see where they make Airbuses and visit this church if you're into churches. Here's a diagram of the plan. The colors represent different ages of construction, cross section. You can see it has the nave and the triforium. There is no clerestory. It has side aisles, and this is a structural diagram of that nave vaulting. It's just two crossing vaults, groin vault here. But what they did was instead of making a groin vault, it became a ribbed dome that goes up into the tower itself. Not very far, but the tower covers that ribbed dome. The cruciform plan showing the groin vault, but then that groin vault becomes a dome. The transepts, the nave. Here's the chevet here, so you could walk around this, and it has two side aisles on either side of the nave. We'll look at the basics of the Gothic vocabulary of stone construction. Romanesque arches. You can see those, the barrel vaults, the groin vault, just here. These are in the side aisles. Again, they have a problem. They haven't figured out how to do a groin vault on a rectangular space yet. And this is what it looks like in a cross section. There's no timber roof here. This is all fireproof. There's a gallery up here, triforium, and groin vaulted side aisles. These half vaults on the sides in the triforium were hidden, and they became what is later called flying buttresses when they're exposed. Remember that the vault is a compression thing, so they cut the vault in half, pushed it against the spring line of this vault, and so that carries that outward thrust down, and they used this, they figured it out. They have step buttressing and so forth on the side. You can see that here. And what's kind of interesting about this is they have blind clerestory windows, meaning these windows don't go anywhere. You can see they just go into a massive masonry that's used to control the outward thrust. And what's significant about that, from the outside, you see the traditional basilical form. Side aisles, the triforium, and the clerestory lighting, but there's no light getting in here. They use the triforium, windows in the triforium to light the nave, and from the side aisles, here's a window here. These are the side aisles, the triforium windows, the blind clerestory windows, and this is the first time I've seen gargoyles. They're not on the roof. All a gargoyle is a rain spout. They're made very obvious in Gothic architecture. And I wanted to show these windows because you can see how thick this masonry is. And what they did was they splayed the masonry open, so any light that they could get coming through the window, it would reflect off of these splayed walls to help bounce light back into the dark interior. This, of course, is well lighted. This is a fisheye view of the five-aisle church. It's beautiful, worth a visit. There's the outside of it. I do have two stories that I wanted to share with you. So these are about capitals, and I love, once I got into these, I really love medieval architecture and sculpture and painting. This is a story of Jonah being swallowed by the big fish. There they are, these happy sailors. And there's the ship in the sea, and the ship's crew throws Jonah overboard. That poor guy up here, you know, he's not alone, doesn't think that's so great. The whale, the big fish, is right here. You can see his teeth, and there's poor Jonah and his derriere going inside. So he's fleeing from the Lord and is swallowed by the big fish. This one is really poignant. This is the beheading of John the Baptist, and it tells a story starting from the right side of this pilaster cap. And let me get into it because we don't have much time. Here's John the Baptist right here. Here's the executioner. And the executioner's sword, you can see the hilt of his sword here and the tip of the blade here, and he's cutting through John's neck. So now we look at the front. Here's the executioner we saw on the side. There he's cutting off John's head there. And now we see the executioner turned, and he's got John's head in a basket. You can tell that's the executioner. He's got his sword. There's the head. There's Herod's stepdaughter Salome giving the head to King Herod. And then John's head, the king has it. And these are the names, the same people we looked at on the side. There is Salome, and there is King Herod Antipas. I think it's just an absolutely beautiful sculpture talking about the way of instructing about stories in the Bible. And then just lastly, what you need to keep in mind about the Romanesque, they use round arches, massive stone walls with small openings, therefore dark interiors, stone vaults for fireproofing, buttresses and piers. There is usually a large tower over the crossing like you see here at Cluny. Churches with relics became pilgrimage destinations, the cult of the relic. And that's how this architecture moved through France into Spain, down into Italy, and up into Germany and across the channel into England. The Cluny Benedictine Monastery was the monastery, the model for many, probably hundreds and hundreds of monasteries thereafter. The sculpture in the church was, like I just showed you, was to educate the worshiping population. And the Italians, this is the beginning of kind of an animosity between the French and the Italians. The Italians considered what they were doing in France as a debased Roman architecture. So we'll get to the Gothic next. Please try to come for that because it's really cool stuff.
Please join me in viewing the 7th presentation, Gothic Structure and Abbot Sujet, as we expand the stone vault structural vocabulary in search of mystical interiors to express the belief that God is light. Kindly leave any questions or comments you may have below, and thank you.